right then. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I hope you're doing very, very well and staying healthy. I'm Carolina Stenberg. Many of you probably know me. I'm Carolina Stenberg. I'm an associate professor and chair in the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies here at DePaul. And I'm very, very honored to be hosting the presentation of the book Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and revolution in the Americas, written by one of the country's leading writers and thinkers on Central American gangs, violence, refugees, and other issues, Roberto Lovato. I personally enjoyed the reading very much, and I hope you did as well, or will hope you do as well once you purchase it. Before I introduce you to the book, the author, and the book discussant, let me first give special thanks to our co-sponsors, the Women and Gender Studies Department, the Spanish Program, the Center for Latino Research, and the Center for Community and Culture. And we'd also like to especially thank Alejandra Delgadillo, our dear department assistant, who has put in immense work for today, has put with immense patience, and we thank her for all her support and technical assistance. Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and revolution in the Americas. The child of Salvadoran immigrants, Roberto Lovato grew up in 1970s and 80s in San Francisco as MS-13 and other notorious Salvadorian gangs were forming in California. In his teens, he lost friends to the escalating violence and survived acts of brutality himself. He eventually traded the violence of the streets for human rights advocacy in wartime El Salvador, where he joined the guerrilla movement against the US-backed fascist military government responsible for some of the most barbaric massacres and crimes against humanity in recent history. Roberto returned from war-torn El Salvador to find the United States on the verge of unprecedented crisis of its own. There, he channeled his own pain into activism and journalism, focusing his attention on how trauma affects individual lives and societies, and began the difficult journey of confronting the roots of his own trauma. In Unforgetting, Roberto interweaves a first-hand reportage on gang life, state violence, intergenerational trauma, and interconnected violence between the United States and El Salvador. His memoir excavates family history and reveals the intimate stories beneath headlines about gang violence and mass Central American migration, one of the most important yet least understood humanitarian crises of our time, and one in which the perspectives of Central Americans in the United States have been silenced and forgotten. In writing this memoir, he makes the political personal, revealing the cyclical ways violence operates in our homes and our societies, as well as the ways hope and tenderness can rise up out of the darkness if we are courageous enough to unforget. Roberto Lovato is a journalist and a member of the Writers Grotto. As I mentioned earlier, he's one of the country's leading writers and thinkers on Central American gangs, refugees, violence, and other issues. He's also a co-founder of Dignidad Literaria, the national movement formed to combat the invisibility and silencing of Latinx stories and books in the US publishing history. He's also recipient of a reporting grant from the Pulitzer Center and a former fellow at USC Berkeley's Latinx Research Center. His essays and reporting have appeared in numerous publications, including Guernica, Boston Globe, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, Los Angeles Times, Der Spiegel, L'Opinion, and other national and international publications. We also have the immense pleasure today of having Ester Trujillo as the book discussant. Dr. Ester Trujillo, she's our assistant professor in the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies at DePaul. She's an interdisciplinary scholar of Central American Studies and Chicano Studies. Her areas of research and teaching include ethnic boundary making, ethno-racial identity formation, intergenerational historical memory, and Central American immigrant integration. She's also recipient of the Visiting Scholar Fellowship at Brown University's Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America and the Woodrow Wilson Career Enhancement Fellowship. So we'll begin this presentation asking Roberto to read some of the remarkable sections of the book. We will follow that with a very interesting conversation between Ester and Roberto that will take about 40 to 45 minutes. And the 45 minutes left of this event will open up for questions from the audience. And on that note, I'll ask everyone to write the questions in the chat box. Alejandra will collect them and share them with Ester, that she will read them after the book discussion. Also, I will ask you to please silence your mic to avoid any background noise. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Roberto Lovato.
Gracias, Carolina. Thank you to the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies at DePaul, the Center for Latino Research, the Center for Religion, Culture, and Community, the Department of Women's Studies, and the Spanish Department for providing me these auspices. I wish we could do this in person, and we will.
Yeah.
Pero mientras tanto, les mando un gran abrazo a todos. Thank you. It's my honor and privilege to be with you, and I'm very grateful to you, especially Ester, Salvadoreña, who is, kind of a shining star in our academic community and beyond. And especially grateful to Carolina, who, when my book came out, was one of the first people in the country, in academia in particular, and generally, to reach out to me to invite me to speak. So you have no idea the great risk you've taken for your career, your department, and the whole enterprise, but I appreciate it nonetheless. What I thought I would do I'm going to read very briefly a section. A lot of the attention that's paid to my book has to do with El Salvador. Like, if you look at the way that the publishing industry, publications like Kirkus or Publishers Weekly refer to my book, they refer primarily to the agony of the Salvadoran people, and these really dark phrases that anybody who's read anything about Central Americans is thoroughly familiar with. And while there is darkness, part of the point of my book is that all is not darkness with us. There is immense light, luminescence, and power among Central Americans from El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua. And you saw this light during, for example, the early years of the revolutionary movements, most of which have kind of fallen by the wayside, unfortunately. But, part of my journey is to excavate the heart lost in the darkness of the past. That is the official story, both in our families, but also in the governments, right? So I'm going to read a little part from here in San Francisco. I'm here on Mission Street in the San Francisco Mission District, where my office is, about 3 blocks from where I grew up on Folsom Street, near the projects on what used to be called Army Street and now Cesar Chavez. And I'm just in 1979 in San Francisco in my adolescence with a friend of mine named Lalo. And then I'll, okay, so let me just read. Lalo and I hung out all morning and afternoon that sunny Saturday. The thick stainless steel chain Lalo used as a belt rattled as he walked up to the store, as we walked to the store up the street from his family's apartment on 23rd and Guerrero. Fuck that shit, man, Lalo said, lisping on the in that. I sported a tank top and a regular leather strip, not a chain for a belt. My 16-year-old body was buffed as my brother Ramon got tired of confirming in response to my daily question, "Hey, ma'am, do I look buffed?" after doing curls, bench presses, and other lifts. "Do you mean more buffed than when you asked me yesterday, or only since you asked me a few hours ago?" Whatever Mem said, I was pretty buffed. As Lalo and I reached the sidewalk in front of the store, a big cholo looking dude in a Pendleton shirt, baggies, and wino shoes bumped into me. "Watch your ass, Ese," the big cholo shouted. I wasn't sure how to respond. Some part of me wanted to avoid fighting. The buff part of me weighed in on the side of punching. But before I could act, the cholo dude pushed me. I fell on the sidewalk, breathing in to ready myself to either get hit or start firing back on him. As he prepared to start wailing on me, I got up and tackled him. Barely conscious of what had transpired, I gave him a right hook in the face with even more fury than I'd ever given the punching bag in the gym at Mission High School. I kept punching until his mouth, his nose, and the back of his head were bloody. I got up and continued into the store, proud of what my buff power had done. Decking a big cholo dude with such ease was cool. I felt like fucking Rocky beating Apollo Creed. "Little bitch, not so bad after all," I grumbled to Lalo as I approached the tall fridge with the drinks. As I decided on root beer, Lalo's voice called out from the front of the store, "Tito, watch out. He's coming at you again." The big cholo dude approached me slowly, his head cocked to his side like he was sizing me up and moving around like a boxer in a ring preparing to fire me up. I quickly gave him a side kick I learned at Carlos Navarro's Kempo Karate Studio on Mission Street. The kick landed on his chest. I kept kicking him in the chest, stomach, and head, back to the door until he was outside again, fell to the ground, nearly unconscious. My internal voice was bragging. "Check out what I did to that fucker. Check out what I did to that fucker." But outwardly, I didn't let on that it was a big deal. I went back into the store where Lalo and I finished our purchases, then went back to Lalo's house. Lalo's parents had baptized him Edgar, a name he detested. He chose Lalo as his placazo, his chosen clique name. Mine was Tito, the name my brothers called me. The others had placazos like Scrapo and Casper. The only one of us who didn't have one was my best friend Hiram. Nobody knew why. We were all insecure, coming together in our own very hardcore, not very serious as a clique, and not very originally named Los Originales. All of us, except Hiram, had major issues with our fathers. When I returned to our crowded Folsom Street apartment from Lalo's, Mom let me know my orders. "Your father wants you to go to Hunt's with him." "Fuck him, Mom," I fired back. "He wants me to go to Hunt's while he buys and sells his bullshit." My dad was in contraband. "You need to calm yourself. That temper of yours is el demonio and will only get you in trouble." "Demonio? You call yourself Catholic? You help him with that bullshit, don't you, Mom? Come on." "That bullshit helped pay for you and your brothers and sisters' education," she reminded me, as she often did. "And you know that it was your abuelita who started buying stuff in San Francisco and then sending the boxes of goods on boats to El Salvador, right?" "Yeah," I responded. "I know." Mom knew how much I loved her and Mama Te. All of us did. I'd heard the stories of long trips from the port of San Francisco to the port of Acajutla, not far from Ahuachapan. Mama Te had been the first in our family to establish herself in the United States. "You should go hang out with Mama Te," Mom told me, knowing my abuelita's good-natured picardia would lighten me up. So I went to Mama Te's on 20th in Valencia. She greeted me with her big, shiny smile, her silver front teeth reminding me of the Jaws character in the James Bond movie. "Hola, mi muchachito." Because of who she was, I let her get away with the diminutive of the word muchacho. "Hola, abuelita." She kissed and hugged me before leading me up to her living room with the olive green rug. Her parakeets were singing in their cages, and the light on her singer sewing machine with the plastic treadle was on. The three people who rent rooms from her were out. You know, Abuelita, my fucking father pisses me off. He gets me pissed off because I don't go to that stupid Hunt's Donuts with him. I know, she said. Would you like me to make you some pupusas? Yes, I said, having finally grown to love them. One day, you'll understand that your father's been through a lot, that he had to sacrifice, as we all did, to get here and raise you all here, she said while mixing the masa, loroco buds, and other ingredients she always had ready at a moment's notice. Yeah, I know, but why does he have to drag me into his shit, Abuelita? It's his way of getting close to you, mijo. The time at Hunt's is the only time he gets to be himself. What, a crook? Well, who is or isn't a crook, she asked. Depends on who's saying it. Some would call me a crook. But you know what? What? Fuck them and their mierdas. We're all pieces of broken glass, stained with blood, and struggling to put ourselves back together, she said in that sudden poetic way she bequeathed to Pop, along with an understanding of how to conduct cross-border business in stolen goods and a silence around their former life in El Salvador. Around 8, I left Mama Tay to go find my homies to do our usual, drinking, smoking, and snorting in St. Peter's parking lot. We also stole cars and committed other crimes, which put me in a bind when I rallied against Pop's shady shit, making me something of a hypocrite. After hanging out with Los Originales at St. Peter's, I came home drunk and high that night to find Pop waiting for me. He was standing outside my room. I stumbled as I tried to sneak in quietly through the window, as was my habit whenever I came home wasted. Está borracho, Pop said in recognition of my inebriated state. Estoy borracho y qué? I said, using the familiar Cholo phrase meaning, and what of it? A clear and unprecedented act of defiance in a household where Pop lorded it over my laid-back brothers and sister like an old-school Salvadoran patriarch. The shock in Pop's eyes surprised me, so did the hint of fear. I'd never seen him look scared. Alongside my own fear at my defiance, I felt something unexpected. My own power, my inner rebelde. Pop yanked me down the hallway, around the corner, and into his room. My stomach tightened, preparing for him to slap me, or worse, and administer the more lasting punishment. Curses of hijo de 60,000 putas, or huevón, lazy, I need to say that, and other standards in Pop's repertoire of humiliation. In his room, he stood me next to his bed while he went behind the door of his room and pulled out a stick he kept in the room for burglars. He stepped closer to me in the slow, deliberate way he knew created dread, and drew back to start hitting me with the stick. He was screaming something, but I barely heard him because I was leaving my body. But before I completely disassociated, something pulled me back, and suddenly I was charged with electricity. Before the stick landed on me, I grabbed it from him. In my crazed state, I paused to gaze at the stick, stopping time to stare at its wood and contours. And then I broke it in two. Fuck, what are you doing? Pop's punishing you for fucking up. Don't do this, a part of me thought. But I continued to do the previously unimaginable. I grabbed Pop by his thin shoulders and pushed him onto the bed in what was both an angry display of power and a way to prevent him from beating me and me from retaliating in kind. Despite all his limits, he loved me. Through my tears, I saw Pop's look of shame and confusion. For a moment, his eyes looked like those of a child. I could suddenly see how vulnerable he really was behind all the machismo, and my sadness started overcoming my rage. Unfortunately, Pop's rage was starting its second run. He reached behind the bed, and his hand emerged clutching his .357 Magnum. He pointed it at me. You're never going to touch me again, or I will kill you, hijo de 60,000 putas, he yelled. I pulled down my shirt to show my heart and said with heavy drunken irony, Go ahead, shoot me, your beloved son. Before things could escalate further, Mom rushed, crying, no, no, stop, both of you, stop, please. You're killing me. Mom separating us added a new load to an already devastating moment. Pop crumpled. Her look at him was as fierce as I'd ever seen. I started crying as well. Pop simply looked away. After, Pop and I stopped talking. We no longer hung out at Hunt's or anywhere else. And I sought out new ways to rebel against him and my Salvadoran family, enlisting a new ally against hypocrisy, Jesucristo. Uh, so that is just a small taste of my childhood here in the mission. And I mean, one of the ways you can read my book is a story of my rebellion against against the silence imposed in our families. But then, you know, it becomes political, and it's a silence imposed not just by our padre, but by la patria. Whichever patria you belong to, it's an enforcer of silence. That's what patrias do, right? Very few patrias have been emancipatory and given to give us our voices. We generally have to fight against them to regain our voices, and that's part of what I did with my book, was to perform an act of memoria histórica, the rescuing, the collective rescuing of memory in the pursuit of justice, as is a tradition in America Latina. And so, I mean, another way you can look at my book is an attempt to, you know, I'm a US born dude from Folsom Street here in San Francisco. I'm not some tropical vato from El Salvador. God bless our tropical brothers and sisters in the South. I love them. They taught me much, but I'm from here, and I generally have to emphasize that a lot. But my mission is to take what I learned from down there, the best of the revolutionary traditions and culture, and pipe them in here, especially at a time like what we have right now, where whoever you are watching this right now, you're in the middle of facing the fight of your life. And I'm not talking about COVID. I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm not talking about fascism. I'm not talking about the decline of the economy. I'm talking about all of those, but I'm talking about, if we deal with all of those, we're then going to actually deal with the real fight of our lives, which is climate change. And so to face these epic challenges as a human race, we're not going to Democrat or Republican our way out of this. It's simply not going to happen. I think I have two words that have already proven that beyond the shadow of a doubt. In the case of immigration, for example, Barack Obama. So I wrote the book because I think we're going to need what sociologists call a millenarian sensibility, a sense of struggle that lies deep inside of ourselves but is asleep, that in traditional cultures is like the warrior spirit, that which is the reason when you enslave people, you cut them off from their language and from their homelands, because you don't want that warrior spirit to be animated to challenge your modern nation state structures, is my theory. And so my contribution to this is unforgetting. So welcome to my world.
Thank you, Roberto, for that insightful reading and remarks. And you covered a lot of topics, and you pointed out to so many things that I'm glad that Esther will continue this conversation, will guide you, or actually point out to specific topics that you address in the book, and unpack them. So Esther, I welcome to join the room. You're already there, but welcome you to take the voice.
Thank you, Caro, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you all here. And Roberto, I'm so happy that you selected that passage, because I think a lot about where I'm from. You know, I grew up in El Sereno in Los Angeles, went to Wilson High School, and I grew up with neighbors and friends who were going through exactly what you described in that passage. A lot of fighting against people at school, people in their neighborhood who are trying to police them, people at home who don't understand, right, what it is to be the child of an immigrant, to grow up in the United States, to know that, you know, you're partially American, partially Salvadoran, but not really having a full sense of what either one of those things is. So I've prepared some questions, but before I do that, I know that we have students here. And so I want to contextualize a little bit about what it is that the content in Roberto's book, from my perspective, tells us about our field, where we are as, you know, Latinx studies, Latin American studies, and then the field of Central American studies, which is my area and the area closest to my heart. You know, the book starts with a metaphor that you use, Roberto, the machete of memory. And in the field of Central American studies right now, we're in a pivotal moment where many scholars are talking about what this means. We're actually actively trying to theorize it as a field. You know, what does it mean to have a loss of intergenerational memory? What does it mean to have silences in our communities? You know, Professor Julia Dixon Gomez has an article where she talks about the ways that people inherit trauma in the body, right? How people have nervios, how people will come down with illnesses that are actually trauma related.
Mhm.
We have, you know, Professor Rodriguez, who's talked about secondhand memories. We have Professor Osuna, who's talked about obstinate transnational memory. And then Professor Susan Coutin, who's talked about re/membering. And that really talks to not just the idea of our memory being disconnected from our parents' experiences, but also the literal dismembering of bodies. El Salvador had this terrible civil war, which you talk about in the book with a lot of detail, the sites of death, the sites of, you know, locating bodies. And in addition to that, you do something in the book that's really fascinating that really captivated my attention, which was that you wove the narrative. I think you described it as a braided narrative.
Mhm.
And so for those of you who haven't read the book, I highly recommend it. I think maybe Alex had the link, Alejandra had the link to our preferred place where we would like, if you want to purchase the book. So maybe you can drop it in the chat, Alex. But for those of you who haven't read it, when you pick up this book and you start to go through the chapters, it's gonna go quickly for you. It's gonna be engaging. And then when you get to that part 2, there's a different narrator. Right? And then you're like, wait, who's talking? And then you get confused. And then you're like, wait, hold on, who's that? And so that confusion that you feel when Roberto jumps from one narrator to the next is kind of the point, right? It's meant to shake us and to make us think twice about, you know, when I tell you my story, it's not just my story, it's actually the story of multiple people. And so something that I think that is also masterful that Roberto has done is that he's connected those pieces of memory with places. And I know that there's this Salvi thing that we do, which is, you know, you're like, oh, you're from El Salvador? I'm from there too. And people go, oh, really? What part? And so people want to right away locate you geographically in their, spatially, right? And so Roberto, you give us these locations that are so specific and so important, that are part of a discourse that's also happening in Central American studies. We're talking about the geography of memory. So some of the work that's being done right now, for example, by my Afro-Hondureño colleague, Professor Pablo Lopez Oro at Smith College, he's talking about, you know, how is it that, you know, Blackness and anti-Blackness is connected to how we think of space. Right, so in El Salvador, the idea that there's no Black people because we don't have a Caribbean coast, that kind of thing, right? Where are people located in our imagination? And then, you know, there's so much work that's being done as well in education related to the experiences of children, which you also touch upon in this book, not just with your experience as a child going through this variety of challenges, you know, with culture and with wanting to understand where family is from, but also with the children who are located right now in detention centers. There's a fascinating passage in the book where you visit Carnes detention center, and the children in that detention center are drawing. And it made me think of the work of my colleague, Dr. Sylvia Rodriguez Vega, who's writing about how children will draw what they can't speak. Right? So the unspeakable violence is in our drawings, it's in our literature, it's in our bodies, and we feel it. And so I just want to encourage everybody, please pick up this book. Now, I think more than ever, it's very urgent that we think about the perspective from which these narratives are told. And so jumping off of that, Roberto, let's start these questions, because as we discuss, we'll get more questions. I already see some in the chat, but I wanted to ask you, let me see. The first one here is just, what can we do about the layers of violence that exist in our lives? So in the book, you touch on a lot of them, the indigenous genocide, the Civil War, the police riots that were happening in Los Angeles. It's so much to unpack. How do we make sense of it? How did you make sense of it?
Well, the first thing I did was write a book, right? So it took me a whole book to try to make sense of it. Even now, I can't completely make sense of the irrational forces that drive government to slaughter people, that drive men and families to beat their kids and abuse them, or women, and sometimes a dog. So these are partly the product of those unspeakable things you talk about. Like something in my book that nobody's noticed yet, but I'll mention it, is that I don't hardly use the word trauma, right? Because everybody writes about, hey, I'm writing a memoir, it's about trauma. And other people would describe it that way, but you can't go in my book and find the word except maybe once or twice. And somebody else is using it, who I was interviewing or something, uses it. And so that's part of I think, the work is to try to get at the unspeakable that you can't really name, touch, feel, because that's what trauma is. Trauma is those things which you cannot look at because they're so too difficult. You can only go around them and try to build, kind of like, the myth of Perseus, right? Who slew the Medusa. That's a misogynist Greek myth, but it's really useful in terms of the way that if you look at Medusa straight on, you're going to turn to stone. You're going to die. So the way to look at Medusa is through the mirror, right? He could see the Medusa and then act on it without looking directly at Medusa. And so by the same token, I think stories, mythology, family narratives, legends, etc., are ways to get at that unspeakable stuff for me. I think this is the necessary work right now, because you don't get a president like Donald Trump unless you forget, right? You forget the history of US genocide, of deep foundational racism, of military industrial power that destroys not just within the borders, but beyond the borders, policing. And so the memories I'm trying to excavate are as much about the memories of nations as they are about the memories of my family and my own memory. And they're all related. So my best attempt at trying to stitch things together is this book. I adopted the braided narrative that you mentioned precisely because I wanted the reader to experience what I experienced as much as possible. Like, I was a crazy kid, as you could hear from the reading a little bit. I was violent. We stole cars. We dressed up in these outfits. We were fighting. We robbed people. We dealt drugs. We were arrested, sometimes jailed, etc. And then I decided to join the FMLN eventually, this Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional, as was the thing to do if you were for social justice fighting fascist military dictatorships in Central America, whether it was in Nicaragua early on or Guatemala and in Salvador. And so I never knew why I did these crazy things. I never knew why I was this crazy dude, honestly. I thought it was just because I was crazy. And eventually, in the course of my life and in the course of the book, I come to realize that my dad had this heavy secret that I will not tell you about because I don't want to mess it up for the reader. Otherwise, you won't experience what I want you to read, which is the experience of having lived a certain life, but having all these things underneath awareness that you never knew were there, were doing their work to kind of like, you know, like a puppet, like making you do things like I like to say, a gang member is nothing if not a walking, talking, fighting, unresolved trauma, right? And a person in the military is similarly, and one that's been given the work of amnesia, of forgetting, right? In order to make good soldiers, good gang members, good death squad operatives, all of whom I interview in the book and I speak with, you have to have amnesia and erasure. And so this is why to face the world we're dealing with right now, we have to look backward as much as we have to look forward in a world that we live in right now. So this was my attempt to do this.
And you mentioned, you know, having this anger and not knowing where it comes from. And I feel like that's such an important thing to talk about because especially for Central Americans and Salvadorans, and I'm thinking about the imagery in the book. You talk a lot about volcanoes, you talk a lot about mountains, valleys. So as I was reading, I was thinking about, well, what are the highs and the lows of our experiences, of our culture, of our history? But inside of the volcano, you know, things are happening, things that we don't get to see until there's an eruption. And then the result of it is just devastation. And so one of the themes that came to my mind, aside from the highs and lows of these valleys and mountains, is the theme of rage and how it's almost like a slow bubble. Before you know it, it comes out in some way. And for you in the book, it comes out, you know, almost at this moment where you're physically confronting your father. And then with the decision that you made about how you were going to carry out that rage, right? So I don't know if you want to talk, if you have more to say about the rage part.
Yeah, I could go on for rage. I could write a whole book about rage, but
I mean, you did.
before anything, my book isn't just about rage. It's about what rage and other parts of ourselves that are forgotten produce. Like on un volcán, if you go to Central America, the most fertile parts of, like my mom's hometown, San Vicente, is right next to the Volcán de Chinchontepec, one of the most glorious volcanoes in Central America. I'm sorry, I'm biased. It's my mom's hometown. You look at that volcán, it's so beautiful. The valley, El Valle de Jiboa, it is so lush, so full of mangos, jocotes, anonas, people, chickens, you know, just like, wow. And, and that part of our story is kind of like, that part of our story is kind of left out. If you look at the stories like I did of those children who were separated from their moms in 2018 by Donald Trump. As a journalist, I went with a team of people to look at the reporting in all the major media, CNN, MSNBC, Washington Post, New York Times. And I looked at it from the perspective of, as a journalist, I looked at it, well, who are the sources here? Who's telling the story of Central Americans? Who did the journalists select? And so I was looking for how many scholars like Ester Trujillo, Suyapa Portillo, Steve Osuna, Jorge Cuellar, Lacey Abrego, the list goes on because there's a lot of us now. How many community leaders like Larissa Cuadra here in San Francisco, just down the street at Carecen, or Marta Revalo at Carecen in Los Angeles? How many Central American lawyers? There's a bunch of lawyers. Some of them are doing a lot of bad shit, but some are doing good things. You know, there's how many Central American journalists are in the stories? And anybody want to guess quickly how many we found with this team of people in one of the most important stories of 2018 in terms of the sheer numbers of stories? How many did we find?
They write it in the chat.
The answer is, let's see, in the chat, somebody wrote, no, nobody's saying. So I'll give you the answer in the name of time. The answer,
I think it's 5.
mierda. Okay, some of you said 0, but the answer is ni mierda. Okay, it's a Salvadoran answer. There wasn't a single Central American expert in the story about Central American refugee people, because I went and I looked at Homeland Security statistics of who was being imprisoned in these immigrant prisons by Obama and then Trump. And I found that 90-something% were Central American. So you've got a Central American story being told by non-Central Americans. And so the only Central Americans are two-dimensional stories of pain and sound bites of suffering. So this is like the background to, I've been dealing with this stuff for 30 years, observing, watching the growth of the Central American intellectual community in the United States as embodied with Ester, with you, Ester, and others. I've been watching as different waves of migration come. I've been watching US policy. I've been watching, policing of Central Americans that helps create the violent gang and that discursively creates it too. And so I have, and I'm bubbling with rage at this stuff, right? Because it's like, damn, in literature, there's not a single book that's nonfiction that's by or about Central Americans until my book right now. Not a one. And we've been here for decades. Some even trace our back to the 19th century. We've been here in San Francisco, where people came with the coffee because Hills Brothers and Folgers Coffees are headquartered here. And so the Salvadoreños started coming to San Francisco more than most other places. And so the rage is there because it's the rage of the silence that's there. My initial expression of it was rebelling against my family, rebelling against my padre, but I reached a point where me empezaban a concientizar mis familiares en El Salvador. There's like a chapter where my tia Esperanza, I'm sure a lot of you have your tias over there, and they're funny and they're very, tienen mucha picardía. Mi tia Esperanza would be watching President Armando Molina, fascist military dictator in the 70s. He'd be on television doing like the state TV thing of a dictator. And Tia Esperanza would go, venga, venga, and she would march us around the television, and she would pucker up her lips, and she would march and start acting like Molina, which was a very subtle political critique that my tia, with like a second grade education, was like kind of sharing with me. So I had different family members doing that, or like her son was the first person that gave me the poetry by this guy named Roque Dalton. And that guy had some poem that said, todos nacimos mitad muertos en 1900, medio muertos en 1932. I didn't know what it meant, but it sounded cool because I felt half dead. My Spanish wasn't as good as it is now, but I knew what medio muerto meant. And I knew that was a feeling I had in my heart. And that medio muerto feeling is the rage part, is where the rage is located. And eventually I transitioned the rage against myself and away from my family and towards the state. And I politicized my rage, which I think a lot of us now are going to have to do with even greater urgency, regardless of who wins the election, because of this crisis I mentioned earlier.
And so that makes me think of this idea of, our community intellectuals, because you mentioned the scholars, and there are scholars, there are journalists, there are lawyers, there are activists who are community professionals right there. And I won't say they're professional activists, but they're people who run and administer nonprofits. But aside from those people, in the Salvadoran communities that we have in various parts of the country, we have these organic intellectuals, we have these community intellectuals that are really people who are almost I don't know what else to call them but revolutionaries, right? Because these are people who are out here, like you said, like your tia Esperanza, with maybe no formal education, people who maybe don't know how to read, or who have decided that the things in school are not the things they want to read, right? So we have people in our communities who have so much knowledge, so much drive, so much rage, and so much desire to make something change for themselves, maybe initially, as in the case with our, you know, our gang affiliated youth, or our youth who want to rebel against their families. And then that's also the case among the FMLN in El Salvador in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. And so I was wondering if you could say more about that theme or that concept in your work about revolutionary. It seemed to me from the reading that you know, that rage that you felt as a young person, you wanted to take it out in some way. You wanted to show out. You know, I don't know how else to say it. Like, what's the intellectual way of saying showing out? Like, you want to show out and make a fuss because something's wrong. Like, you know something's wrong and you want to do something, say something, but how?
Mm-hmm. That's why I start off in the family. I have a personal theory that it's called my shit travels downward theory of Salvadoran and other violence. Basically, the state brings violence on the workers, and then the workers go to their family, and then the father will then take it out on the kid or the mom or the dog. And so that shit travels downward. And then the state will use some of those angry workers to do its own violence. And you got people like some of my family members that are now cops. Like a lot of us, Latinos are the primary source of border patrol right now. So it used to be, it was all a white thing when they had the border patrol. And there used to be this word that we used to use in the 70s that is vendidos, which the Chicanos came up with. But now they've made it cool to be and well paid to be in the border patrol, right? And policing migrants. They've made it very like acceptable to be in the military. They've made it acceptable to be cops, like cops in my family, who I've had sad to say have adopted even, I think, at this stage in U.S. history, a lot of cops carry neo-fascist ideology. If you look at studies that show that a lot of cops carry neo-fascist ideology. Okay, there's the Brennan Institute and others that have done these studies. I've not even just studied them. I went and I interviewed these cops. I got family member. And I remember from El Salvador, like, you know, I'm there in 2013 praying for my mom's soul, even though I'm not a big believer, but, you know, my mom would kill me if she knew that I didn't pray for her soul. Praying for my mom's soul, but I'm distracted because I look to my left and there's this dude who's got all these tattoos on his hand, and I look, and who it is? It's his cousin of, era un primo del esposo de mi prima, my cousin's husband's brother, who we knew was an escuadronero, a member of the Salvadoran death squads. And so, you know, our families are really tied into this, in many cases in Central America, now in the United States, into these fascist structures. And those are the things we don't talk about. So I really wanted to talk about these things and starting it in a very intimate way with our own connection. I mean, as Salvadoreños, we're the children in one way or another of Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, el dictador, el general, the general that perpetrated something called La Matanza, which is, I've spoken to scholars at Oxford, like Anders Sandberg. He's heads of Future Institute, and they study violence around the world. And it's in the book. Anders told me that 1932 El Salvador, when they killed somewhere on the order of around 10 to 30,000 people, was one of the single most violent episodes, not just in the Americas, but in world history, in terms of the numbers of people killed per day, per week in a concentrated space. So when you start discovering this, it's like, whoa, 70% of Salvadoreños don't even know about La Matanza. This is why, again, we make good soldiers, good gang members, good actors of violence. Good in quotes, right? And so I discovered in my own family an umbilical connection to this episode of extreme violence. And I draw the line that runs from 1932, mass murder by the state, to the murder of gang members and the gang killings of other gang members and the violence in the present, because that's the way memory is in institutions, but it's also the memory in our families, and they're connected. And I try to draw the lines, and I cross the border, which is why I had to do the book the way you mentioned, Esther, which is haciendo como un chapulín, jumping from one period and one chapter to another, and then back to 2015, the 70s, 1930s, back to 2015, pum, 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 because that's the way memory works, right? Our memory isn't like, first I was this, then I was that. But you're there, you're hearing me right now. I say something about a military guy who's like your uncle, and you go back and you start thinking about your Theo who used to beat up your cousins or something, right? That's the way memory works. It's like all these different voices. And so I'm trying to reflect that in the book.
I do think that, and even as you speak, I'm thinking about my uncle who's in the sheriff's department and LA, LAPD sheriffs, and also of people who I've known from high school who joined the military, people who are part of the Border Patrol today. So something that I want to remind everybody to put your questions in the chat so that we can collect them as we go, and anything goes. You want to ask about the content of the book, ask. You want to ask about the writing process. I know some of you want to be writers, and like Roberto said, we do need more stories out here. You're right, Roberto, there's not enough literature written from the points of view of folks like us, right? And this brings me to not the final question, but just one of the ones I prepared for you, because recently there's been, and this is the other area y'all can ask about, which is the chambre, right? The chisme chambre, aka current events. Okay, that's what we'll call them. But in the last year, there is this kerfuffle about a white author who wrote a novel about the migrant experience and got a huge book deal. We won't say their names because they have enough money. But there, in response to that, there was, this kind of rising up of anxieties and anger and just thoughts like, y'all couldn't find an actual immigrant to tell an immigrant story, or, so I guess the question here is, that we think about in our courses at DePaul is, who has the right to tell a certain story? Can that and should it be policed? Should it be observed? Should it be, And so your book was published by a major press. It's not independent, self-published. It was published by Harper. And that's super important. Your book is going to be in every store. I don't know if you want to tell us where you've seen your book, but how did this book come to be? And can you tell us a little bit about your involvement in the response to, that one book being published? And then your involvement with Dignidad Literaria, which I think is an extremely key literary movement for Latinx people right now.
Wow, okay, that's a pretty hefty question there. I'll try my best to answer. The Dignidad Literaria came about because of that book, American Dirt, by that unnamed author who's white, and then suddenly discovered she was Latina just before she published her book. There's interviews with her in the New York Times, which is, yeah, I'm white, I have white privilege. And then later on, hey, I got a grandmother or great grandmother who I'm some like 1/8 Latina. So then they start promoting her, they dress her up in this folkloric outfits, and they toss her out into the world. Here's our latest Hispanic author who's going to give you the real story of migration, right? And she basically, what she did in American Dirt was take an essentially Central American story. Like, I've been down to Mexico along the route of La Bestia, and I can tell you most of the people on La Bestia, the train that crosses from southern Mexico up to northern Mexico, the different trains, are Central American, from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, right? And it's an epic journey, really. People get their legs hacked off, they fall off, people die, they're robbed, they're enslaved by narcos and some mareros. it's a heavy story, no doubt. And so this white woman goes and takes the story and then she fictionalizes it and she turns the people on La Bestia into Mexicans. So from there, my lens on this is she just took a Central American story and made it a Mexican story. Like, and she didn't just take it a Mexican story, but she made a story about a Mexican middle class family, a mother and a child, her boy, who witnessed this massacre by some narcos. And so then this mother who's upper middle class and has an ATM and owns a bookstore, is trying to flee uh, Mexico, and she does something that I've never seen in all my decades of researching, writing, interviewing about migration from Central America and Mexico, in fact, which is basically do with her kid. It's not in the book, but there could have been a scene in the book where she did this because she basically went and said, "Okay, mijo, we've got to escape. So do we catch an airplane over to San Diego or LA and overstay our visa because we can afford it? Or do we escape by taking a taxi or having one of our tios with a car drive us to the border? Or do we jump on the train with all the Central Americans and experience extreme terror, violence, and enslavement?" And so just imagine the kid saying, "Okay, mom, let's go get enslaved and violated and raped on the Bestia." Right? This is how absurd the story of American Dirt was. So I saw that my friend Miriam Gerba had challenged the book discursively by criticizing it in this book called You're No Steinbeck, Pendeja, which was brilliant and brought the attention nationally to the book. And then I said, hey, let's take this energy because I'm an organizer. I used to be a strategist in some things in a previous life. So let's take this energy and focus it on where it belongs, on the industry itself, because that book and that author are a product of this industry. So my book came out before that. And I mean, my book was already being written before this book came. I didn't even know about it till earlier this year. So, I'm like looking at this really plastic, fake, ridiculous, racist, stereotype-ridden book, badly written, being like 7 figures, and I'm like, damn, but I got an okay deal. I'm not complaining right now, not yet. I'm gonna get my 7-figure deal next, right? I'm kidding, but I wrote it, and knowing what I know about our story and how comparing the two, it hurt me sometimes to see that, but I didn't let myself wallow in the pain. I acted in the same way that I took the rage against my father, against mi padre, and I took it to la Patria del Salvador and then the Patria de Estados Unidos, right? That's the politicization of rage that I think is necessary for all of us because, again, the state is all about mass producing self-destructive rage, amnesia, and things that help us destroy ourselves and do their bidding so that we don't question the power structures that exist, right? So, and I just want to just say one last thing about my book, which was that book's really ugly in its racism and stuff. And my book has violence, genocide, and mass murder and mass graves, death squads, but, and tú eres mi testigo, Esther, it's actually got a lot of beauty and sublime and shows the power of Central Americans that is lost in the darkness of right-wing fascists like Donald Trump talking about us, or in the darkness of the stories told about us by people like Joan Didion, a beautiful writer, but basically came up with the idea after 2 weeks in the embassy in El Salvador during the war and says, terror is the given of the place. So my book is really about actually, after 56 years, not just 2 weeks, in dealing with Salvadoreños, love is also the given of the place and of the people. And so I proceed to kind of tell the story of the love and the tenderness that survived all that terror and all that violence and all that extremity that our people carry with them in their hearts, in their minds, in their bodies, in our bodies. A lot of us have that. I know you do. I know a lot of you. And so, and we know the power and the beauty that we carry, but the world doesn't seem to know it in the English language yet. But that's now going to change because this is the first book of what will be many, I guarantee you. Not just by me, but by others behind me. Poets like Leticia Hernandez, Maya Chinchilla, writers like poets like Javier Zamora, um, you know, novelists that are coming like this kid at Iowa, Reyes, and many others are on the way. So, you know, our time is here and the world needs to hear our beautiful, powerful, luminous stories. And I want to encourage all of you young people that feel the urge to write, to listen to that voice, because that voice needs to be heard, not just for you and your family, but for this country that's on a major path to crisis.
I think that what you've said is so key, Roberto, that even in the pain, there are these flashes of light and love. And with that, I'll bring the first audience question that I've gotten. What role do you feel the silence imposed by the Patria plays in cycles of violence and intergenerational trauma?
Well, let's look at, great question. Let's look at LAPD. LAPD, I mean, police forces are in the business of manufacturing crime and criminals. That's their job. Without crime and criminality, the ideas of crime and criminality, they're out of business. That's why there's such an opposition right now, heavy opposition to Black Lives Matter and the calls that have arisen out of it for the abolition of prisons and even police forces, right? Because that myth is now starting to die of criminality. And enough of us are now not just aware, but willing to act on it. And so in the book, I never talk about gangs without talking about policing, because you can't. Gangs were created by police in many ways in LA. They, you know, the young people came together out of immigrant loneliness in the late 70s and early 80s in LA in Pico Union, where I worked at Carecen. And these young people, you know, they listened to like Ronnie James Dio, Metallica, and all this other hard, heavy metal music. They were smoking pot, and they were stoners. They weren't violent. They weren't, and they call themselves Mara, which any Salvadoreño, Guatemalteco, maybe the occasional Nica. I don't know if Nicas use it as much as Salvadoreños and Guatemaltecos, but Mara originally meant what?
A group, right?
Group of friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, La Mara. My cousin Adilio in El Salvador in the 70s and 80s, mira, vamos a ir a joder con La Mara. Let's go fuck around with La Mara. So, you know, so I traced the way this word suddenly became equated with the most violent gang in the world, right? Because this is the moniker that think tanks that arose in the early 2000s started creating this idea of the Maras as the most violent gangs in the world. And there's this whole like almost an industry out of the Pentagon and out of think tanks in Washington, D.C. and other places that were literally manufacturing discourse, stories about these gangs as being this most violent. I've done research. There's no statistical basis for it. I have a piece I'm hopefully going to come out soon in a major daily that will remain nameless for the moment because they haven't published it yet. But I wrote a piece about after Donald Trump did a press conference in July of this year, just a couple of months ago. Trump did a press conference with William Barr, and they basically were now escalating the discourse on MS-13. So MS-13 was in the Oval Office before COVID was there, by the way. So, you know, before it became a super spreader house, it was the Oval Office where they had this press conference. And it was focused on MS-13, and they had all these pictures, terrorists, animals, savages. You know it, everybody knows it. It's BS. But I went and I looked behind. I said, okay, what's the statistical basis for this terrorist label? And you can measure it, for example, in terms of, you can measure terrorist intent by, say, homicide rates, for example. So if they're really terrorists, you're gonna have a high homicide rate. So I went around and I called all these different police departments in uh, Long Island, uh, Virginia, in Alexandria, Virginia, Houston, LA, and here in San Francisco. And what did I find in terms of the homicide rate in 2019 among MS-13? I found out that here in San Francisco, the most violent gang in the world killed all of 2 people in 2019. 0 this year. Ni mierda. LA, similar low numbers. In Long Island, where Donald Trump has centered the discourse of anti-MS-13 and terrorism and all this stuff, they've killed an average of 5.5 people per year for the last 10 years. So there's no basis for this way that the story we're getting of MS-13, which is why I go into the gangs, into the clandestine hideouts in El Salvador, in LA, and meeting with them, and realizing most of them are like, a lot of them are children now, and most of them are not violent. So if you look at, like, for example, and I also found out that in 1 month, August 2019, a handful of white supremacists with semi-automatic weapons in Dayton, Ohio, El Paso, and other locations have killed more people than the estimated by the FBI 10,000 members of MS-13 in the United States did in 1 year combined. Again, in 1 month, these handful of white dudes killed more than all of 10,000 MS-13 in a year. This is a measure of the scale of the fictions, the very dangerous fictions that are being woven to police. And so the silence is filled in by the state, by the police, by the media, by politicians, including Democratic Party politicians, because some of those think tanks were funded by the Obama administration during the Obama years. I'm sorry if I'm bursting anybody's bubble, pero es la verdad, lo siento. And so I'll leave it at that.
Well, it's the journalist's job to tell us what we're not hearing in other places, right? And that's why I'm so grateful for the ways that you've been reporting on this. Some of what I teach in my own classes comes from what you find, right? I'm not out there at calling police stations, so somebody has to do it. That's your work. And the next, I'm going to jump around, but the next question is related to what you just said. How do you contextualize gangs, violence, policing, and revolution when you compare the experiences of the Northern Triangle, which for people who don't know is what the state calls El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, when you compare that to Nicaragua? And so the question says, in Nicaragua, where the latter served as a distinct model, where low levels of gang activity, violence, and homicides are low compared to other Central American countries.
Well, I'm going to have to disqualify that question because the person asking it is a guy named Martin Vega, old friend and revolutionary, who I don't want to answer his question. Sorry, Martin, but you're canceled in this thing. So, not seriously speaking, great question. Martin is a person brings a lot of experience in these matters as well, and he comes from the same generation. He's from the Mission District, grew up here too. Like, there's this whole history that I wish I would have included in the book about the way that there was a revolutionary tradition that came from, like, Cuba, like Camilo Cienfuegos spent time here in the Mission. The Nicaraguan revolutionaries were here, and then folks went from San Francisco to fight in the Sandinista revolution, Chileans, and then Salvadoreños, and including Salvadoreños born in the US. Some of us went down and joined the fight. So anyway, that's a little context for this question. So I went to Nicaragua 2 years ago while I was reporting on this, to look at, to try to answer the question, how come, if Nicaragua is right between next door to El Salvador and Honduras, shares a border, how come it doesn't have the gang problem, right? They don't have anything resembling the scale of gang violence and state violence against the gangs, that is. There's a lot of state violence in Nicaragua, don't get me wrong on that, but Daniel Ortega is no longer your friend. But I went to kind of compare and contrast why, and what I found the big difference was las mujeres revolucionarias, the revolutionary women in Nicaragua, and there's a deep, powerful tradition there, basically seized the moment, carpe diem, to institute changes to things like policing and training of police forces. And as a result, they were able to create a different kind of a policing culture that that didn't exacerbate the gang problem like mano dura in El Salvador and the policies of the corrupt, murderous dictatorship in Honduras right now. So it's a story. It's in the Boston Globe. You can check it out. So my answer, maybe somebody can look it up. Boston Globe and Nicaragua and Lovato. Maybe you can put it in the chat because I still got to kind of be here to answer these questions, or I can put it in later.
Yeah, if somebody can link that, that would be great. And so our next question is, to what extent do you link climate change to forms of neocolonialism in Latin America?
Jesus, these scholarly types really give me a pain in the ass, man. It's like, Jesus, it's a hard question to answer. Climate change, and what else?
And forms of neo-colonialism in Latin America.
Well, actually, a really good question. I'm kidding. I actually, unbeknownst to most, I took out like about 45,000 words from my book. And I did it like in 4 days before I had to turn it in because I just wrote. And then I went as I was finishing up and I'm like, okay, how many words is your average memoir? And it was like 80 to 90,000. And I did the word count on mine. I was like 135,000. I was like, oh man. So I had to cut out a whole novella out of my book. One of the things that got cut out, in addition to a bunch of other stuff, was some work I had done going to Juarez, Mexico during the height of the violence in Juarez, or to Turkey near the border with Syria, where you have heavy violence in Syria spilling over into Turkey. And now Turkey, you see, doing really nasty things in Armenia, and we have to be in solidarity with those people. And so, and then in Salvador. So in each of the cases, I did some research, I talked to some scientists, and lo and behold, what did we find out? Climate change was right there underneath, forgotten, but underneath the surface, literally and otherwise. It was so that climate change is flooding entire areas, destroying crop cycles. It's causing drought. It's causing distortions of life in large swaths of the planet. And this in turn drives things like migration, but it also drives migration within countries to cities. And so when you have a limited resource base, like a lot of countries do, and you have it heating up literally, or freezing, or flooding, or changing the crop cycle, you're going to intensify the violent patterns in the countries, what scientists were telling me in the research. So climate change has a lot to do with this. I think the Pentagon, I've always wondered, people say, like, when they try to explain why, for example, you have this practice of caging children, putting them in concentration camps, killing them in the desert with their mothers and fathers when you militarize the border. So these are policies. When Donald Trump does them, they're called fascist, right? So let's just take that term fascist and then apply it to, in the case of caging, it began with Barack Obama, who caged thousands of children, who concentrated thousands of children and mothers, and who Department of Homeland Statistics show pushed 3,000 children, mothers, and fathers to this horrific death in the Sonoran and other deserts. So you can't just say one is fascist without the other. So this fascist practice of why is Obama doing this? People usually explain it by saying, well, he's just trying to be kind of Republican so he can get their votes to win the election. These are the stupid ass, quite frankly, kinds of explanations that we get in the news. But I kind of like to go a little deeper And I go and I look at, like, I travel around the world and I go to like immigration, global migration conferences. And I talk to people, and inevitably who's there are people from the Pentagon now. So the Pentagon is whispering in the ear of the Dominican government that is then going and militarizing the border with Haiti. They're taking the citizenship away from Haitian children born to migrants in Dominican Republic. And so in all these different countries, the way that Mexico, Lopez Obrador, who some of us thought would have made a difference, is treating Salvadoran, Guatemalan, and Honduran children and mothers like Barack Obama and Donald Trump, militarizing, pursuing them, hunting them down. I've spoken to these folks. So, like, if you want to understand it, the Pentagon started producing reports on climate change like about 15 years ago, and they started looking at immigration as a national security issue. So the reason that Barack Obama has these, I hate to say it, had these fascist immigration policies that jail children and kill them is because of reasons of state, raison d'etat, that states have their own way of thinking and what they need. And the state of the United States, regardless of which president, feels that it can't afford to let people in, and it can't especially afford to redistribute the wealth in order to deal with these problems. Because if you're going to solve these problems, you basically have to dismantle capitalism. Okay, I'm sorry, those of you that are getting your MBAs or whatever degrees your parents told you to get, but the capitalism's a total failure. Just look at climate change, because that's not a socialist thing. Okay, it's a capitalist thing.
That's so true. It's very difficult, I think, especially for those of us who are in the system or who are going through our education, to try and figure out how to learn from it and not completely lose our soul. To some extent, we are institutionalized. And so it's difficult because we have to figure out our own path.
Mm-hmm. I have an MBA, by the way, a master's in business.
Yeah, and sorry, there's a light in my face now because the sun is setting in Chicago and it's reflecting, but I'm here. There's this sense of I forget who was it's a Black feminist scholar who said this, but it was like, as soon as you earn the degrees that you've been so eloquently trained for, it is your duty, to go out and lift others up, whether that's your community or other people that are in the process of it too. So thank you, Roberto, for sharing so much of your knowledge with us. And I have more questions. So with the context of capitalist societies and art, what are some of the ways that you think the unspeakable things in our art that our art speaks for can break through the status?
Uh-oh. Okay, we lost Esther there, so I'm just going to assume her question is about the way that art can help us break through the silences. It's kind of what I heard. Do I have your permission to continue that, folks? Okay,
No?
so there she is. So
Oh.
can you repeat the question instead, please?
You were lost for a couple.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah.
So the question was just, what are some of the ways that our art can break through the status quo, and then how do we broadcast these messages in our art?
That's a great and urgent question. I'm going to tell you two stories real quick. All right, let's like I remember when I first started getting concientizado, I like breathing in the spirit of revolution. I felt like, damn, I'm the fucking next Che Guevara, dude. Watch out. Right? That's how you feel when you're a kid and you discover these new weapons, like it's like Luke Skywalker with that, what is that? I'm embarrassed because I'm a big Star Wars person. The lightsaber.
Lightsaber.
You're like, "Argh." So I'm here walking around, ready to be the next Che Guevara, and there's this old man in his office where I was working, and the old man was called Tio Chepe, and so Tio Chepe was like, "Hey, Lovato, come here, man. I want to," and he would give me, he was in Salvadoreño, but he would give me cassette tapes, very detailed, like writing on the tapes. I'm like, that's really nice, viejito, but the revolution's over there, dude. I got time for this shit. but I didn't say that, but that's my attitude of an arrogant 20-something kid that I was. And, he'd give me music, he'd give me like, talk to me about history. And I was like, I kind of like humor him for a while. Hey, viejito, man, I gotta go, dude, right? Revolution can't wait. So one night we have this clandestine meeting. And, only folks who were in what was known as the FPL, Fuerza Popular de Liberación, one of the 5 groups of the FMLN guerrillas. And so we're having a secret meeting of the FPL people, and it's like, compañeros, tenemos el placer de tener con nosotros una figura histórica salvadoreña, una figura trascendental, a transcendental figure of Salvadoran history is going to honor us today. So I'm like, oh, wow, check this out. This guy is a badass dude. And, and there's a big hubbub. They introduce him. They talk about his biography. He helped kick out the dictator of the guy who perpetrated La Matanza, Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez. There was a coup staged against him. This is one of the heroes of that moment in the 40s. And from that moment on, they were talking about this guy was, fighting for his whole life. And then his kids were among the founders of the FPL, the Fuerzas Populares de Liberación. And this old man, they said, was fighting in the mountains up until he was in his late 70s with the compañeros. So then, there's a door, and then suddenly, les presento el compañero José Belisario Peña. And who is it but that old man that I was just kind of dissing? Hey, old man, I ain't got time for you. And I felt that small, right? Because in my arrogance, I didn't realize this titanic figure that was in front of me. And so for me, the art and the artist are never separate from the revolutionary movement. That's one of the most valuable things that I learned from the Nicaraguans, the Guatemalans, the Salvadorans who taught me about this idea of revolución, that it begins with a cultural part. So never look at your art as something artsy-fartsy or, I ain't got, don't be me. Don't be that arrogant kid that didn't have the time to listen to the cassettes, that didn't have time to listen to the stories, that didn't have time to write the stories. Be the one who pursues these ideas in the culture with all of your heart, because right now, the only way we're going to get out of what we're facing right now is for radical acts of political imagination. Radical acts of political imagination. We have to imagine there's a better world is possible, a better world is necessary, and that I'm going to do everything I can in my heart, in my body, with every bit of fucking bone that I have to alter the course of history in my little part of history, in my little corner of the world. So one of the things you can learn from the past is all these marvelous stories of great revolutionaries, great art that were never separated. They were always together.
And I think that what you just said really, it strikes me because many years ago when I was doing my research, I asked a group of young people, what do you think represents Salvadoran culture to the outside, like to everyone who's not Salvadoran? And they said, we don't have anything that belongs to us. They said, we don't have anything that's our own. We don't have, Mexicans have banda. What do we have? And I was like, yo, we have chanchona. Like we have all these other things. Listen, you're right. We cannot be detached from art. And also, I really appreciated what you said about needing to have a revolutionary imagination, because and really being creative with how we move forward. And so the next question is about the writing process. Somebody is asking, what coping skills helped you process the heavy material in the book? And this person says they found themselves taking breaks in between the chapters because there was a mix of emotions, both rage and hope. And Roberto, you know that I've been dealing with this too, because you sent me this book 3 months ago before it was even released. And it was hard. It was hard. We had multiple things that happened, right? Family issues, and then a pandemic, death in the family, all these triggers. So how have you processed what you've had to write?
Well, great question. how do you look at the abyss? How do you look in the underworld? And like the philosopher Nietzsche said, if you better be careful, because if you look at the abyss is going to look back at you. So these are not, I take these matters very seriously. Anybody wanting to do this kind of work needs to think very carefully about how they approach it. Or like as a journalist, when I approach somebody who I know is a survivor of a massacre or a killing or is traumatized or rape or something, I can't just pop in like a lot of journalists do, get the story, okay, tell me what happened, right? Because that's like violating people's integrity. You got to approach it con cuidadito. So approaching myself with cuidadito, the first thing I did before I decided to write this, first I decided to write it. And then the first thing I did was to go retain the services of a therapist, because I knew I carried this story for 30 years that was going to force me, if I was going to be honest and true to the story, to look at my own abyss. And so that it was the abyss of the inherited trauma, the abyss of my familial experience, the abyss of war, the abyss of post-war violence, the abyss of policing and the violent policing that I experienced and that I've seen. And so I retained a therapist, and we mapped out like how I was going to do this, and how parallel to that I was going to kind of use judo like on the abyss. I was going to like go, okay, you got all this power. I'm going to use your power to help myself get healthier and overcome. So the book became an opportunity to become a better self for me. And I had that real clear from the beginning. And I think that's one of the most important things. If you're going to write something that's that deep and goes to that deep and that scary a place, is to have a clear, radical imagination of how you want to come out of this, right? So the personal is the political, because we have to reproduce that same process on a global scale. So yeah, so the therapist and I work through some of this stuff, and you take it slowly. You can't just rush in and be a bull in the china shop of your own experience. You have to kind of like con cuidadito, con cariño, know when to stop. I mean, there were moments like my brother Ramon knows that I wanted to basically take myself out at a moment, because all this stuff just was rushing out. And I had started to drink, not like, I'm not a drinker, like alcoholic or anything, but I had taken to a bottle for a moment when I was with my brother for a couple of days. And he helped, because of the way my brother is, to walk me through. He's where I would go to get that nurturing energy that I needed, that I used to get from my mom who died, and from others. And so, yeah, very carefully is how I would do that. But I think it's a necessary journey to the degree that you can take it. We have to go into the abyss, into the secrets of ourselves, of our families. I mean, I hate to say it, but again, a lot of you young people have uncles, tias, and folks. They're fascists. They're now at a point where, like the evangelical church that your tia belongs to, is basically a factory of fascist ideology in the age of Trump. I'm sorry if I'm offending some of you, but I used to be a minister, and I was going to be a minister in those churches, right? I was a deacon. I was born again. I was preaching the gospel and I got on my knees and I prayed for Ronald Reagan. So like, I know that world. And you look at that world now, and it's militarized. Literally, they're injecting all this hardcore ideology into the churches, into the military, that are siblings and our cousins. And we're in a neo-fascist age. So instead of trying to narrate the story of your family, like, hey, they sound like those fascists, but they're really not. You kind of have to admit sometimes, hey man, my family's a fucking fascist. Okay, I'm sorry, but there's no way around that at this point in U.S. history and Salvadoran history. I mean, just look at Nayib Bukele. He's a neo-fascist. So yeah, that's how I would approach with great care and great integrity and great honesty. But the journey's worth it, because like the psychologist Carl Jung would say, the gold is in the dark. right? The gold is in the dark. You go down in, and like an indigenous, because I just don't use Eurocentric stuff, by the way, in case you're trying to cancel me for that. Pause that. I have it like an indigenous Nahuapipil myth where, not a myth, but a story of the culture where the journey into the underworld is into a place of darkness and fire, and it's hot, and there are all these body parts, but the body parts are alive. They're not like, they can be funny, they can be, the body parts talk. And so and below that part of the underworld is this like turquoise, beautiful place that you got to get to, but you got to get to it, you got to go through the darkness to the turquoise place. So that's how I see like the necessary journey for many of us into our own abyss.
And I feel like I'm ready to write, or somebody tell us in the chat if you're going to write the book called My Uncle the Fascist, My Tío the Fascist, because I feel like I wanted to scream when you said, our evangelical family members are fascists. I'm like, ah, that's literally my lived experience. And to the other thing that you said about incorporating the myths of our indigenous past. In the chat, we have a question from Magali, who, by the way, says, "Thank you for this. My soul needed it. I'm writing a novel, have been for 5 years, about a Salvadoran refugee living in Canada. I see a lot of parallels with La Matanza and the genocide of indigenous people in Canada and the 19th century. In the 19th century and the genocide in the US by white settlers in the name of manifest destiny. I also see huge parallels with ongoing racism toward Latinx and indigenous people. And so the question is, do you think reconnecting with our indigenous roots would be the way to heal the country of El Salvador and Salvadorans as individuals?"
Absolutely. I think we have to acknowledge the culture and the beauty, the way we talk. Like, instead of saying vaya pues, nosotros decimos va pues. Linguists will tell you that's because of the habits of the Nahuapipil peoples to have these like more condensed, I think they're called phoning, or the way that we prepare panes con chumpe, the word chumpe, or you look in the Popol Vuh, the book of the origin of the Mayan peoples, you find mention. When I saw this, I was like, wow, man, that's so cool. Nances, anonas, all these jocotes, all these different fruits that the Maya named, they're with us, they're here, and we're using the words, which means in some respect, we're carrying on those traditions. I think in an oppositional way, we can also use this knowledge of our indigenous past that we share in some way as a counter to nation state thinking, like saludemos la patria valerriata, all that stuff. I mean, the flags, if you don't know, there's a book by a scholar named Patricia Alvarenga on the militarism in the late 19th, early 20th century in El Salvador. And she basically shows how the indigenous people had their own culture, their own connection to the land, even their own militaries. And so the people that were creating this idea in 1821 of the nation state of El Salvador, created this flag that was used to inspire religious sentiments that would either have people die for them or kill for them. And so then the flag and the nationalism were used as a way to either bring people away from their indigenous ways and form them in a more modern way into the nation state of El Salvador, or kill them, right? And so there's an essential violence of the nation state. And so indigenous thought is one way to counter that in my book, literally in my book and in my book. Or, another way is just revolutionary thought. I think I don't have the answer of ¿qué significa revolucionario, Roberto? I'm not that smart. I can't tell you what revolution means today. I know that what we tried to take over the nation state and control of government it's important still, I think, to a degree to have state power, but as we've seen in the case of Nicaragua, you can have an allegedly revolutionary group take power and it's not really doing the revolutionary thing anymore, right? Or when the FMLN was there, and there's stories in my book about how the folks that I ran with in the FMLN would then take and adopt the methods of the fascists using the death squads to pursue the gangs. Okay, you can't be for democracy and social justice if you're using escuadrones de la muerte against the gangs. I'm sorry, that's just not how it is, compa. I mean, probably going to get canceled in certain sectors of El Salvador with this, with some of my old homies, but I'm sorry, that's just where I'm coming from. And so I think any revolutionary now has to think beyond the nation state, right? Or think of, we have to, and the revolutionaries have to wrestle with climate change in terms of like, and go back to the original meaning of the term in the West of revolution, right? Which came from physics and a planet going and doing a turn around the sun and returning to the same place. So now the planet is like in disequilibrium. So we've got to some degree to help return the life sustaining systems back to some equilibrium, because the planet will go to equilibrium on its own, but it may do it by wiping out large numbers of us, as it's doing to thousands of species of animals. This is how urgent it is. And so, I want to I think, indigenous thought has a lot to teach us, and so do other forms of thought and being.
Yeah, I think part of the myth among many Central Americans and just the Americas in general is that indigenous people have been obliterated. We know that's not the true. Indigenous people continue to live. They continue to live through us in our genealogy. And there's also this sense that in especially in the work of Manlio Argueta, right, that indigenous people themselves were brought in to fight against their own gente. And so on that thread, I want to go to this next question that we got, as a Puerto Rican who served in the military. I started to realize after my tour in Afghanistan during the 2016 election that I had been indoctrinated into a fascist structure due to the raids you speak of and a lack of direction. So as a modern colony, what role do you feel Puerto Rico's status as an American Commonwealth, quote, plays into perpetuating the huge amount of Puerto Ricans choosing to serve in the military? And I think this is really connected to this experience of, what are our choices, and then what pushes people to go into these directions?
Again, underneath my bald head is a great limit. I've been to Puerto Rico. I have Puerto Rican friends, authors. You could read my friend Ed Morales. You could read Marisol Lebron and other scholars who are much more informed about this. But I think, the case of Puerto Rico is very particular in America Latina. It's a colony of the U.S. And I think that, but if you look at what happens to Puerto Ricans and their propensity to be in the military, you find it among Mexicans, among Salvadorans, among all of us now. And I actually did a story on the way that Karl Rove, remember him from George Bush's brain? This was like, the guy who was the brains behind that really comical president. Well, that's a relative term now because we have an extraordinarily comical president now. But back then it was George Bush, and his brain was Karl Rove. And Karl Rove, I interviewed the people that were his advisors. And this one guy, I forget his name, but he was a PR specialist living in San Antonio, Texas. And he was a really brilliant guy, right-wing fascist, but brilliant. And he helped Karl Rove figure out how to take Karl Rove's thesis and make it a Latino thing. Like Karl Rove wrote his thesis about the Irish problem in the 19th century that the McKinley presidency had. You had this group that was not exactly white, right? We think they're white now, but back then there was a different perception of them. The Irish were unruly and they needed to be brought under the tent of whiteness. And so McKinley's ideologues came up with the idea of using the military and the police to socialize them, Because remember, these structures, whether it's the police, the military, the border patrol, they're not just guns and repression, they're also cultural entities. They create, they mass produce culture. Just look at your families, right? Look at your nephew like me who has SWAT and is like supporting Trump and raising a family that's pro-Trump, and they're browner than I am. So like by the same token, you have these um, these priorities of state that look at the Latino family and the Latino youth as an opportunity for new soldiers, new killers, new death squad operatives, and new CIA people. So the work you do in your family to help raise awareness is crucially important. And I would just encourage young people to not fight with your parents about it, but just use your example. Because that's what I found out. Once I stopped fighting and I stood my ground and my convictions, mine started to change within the family because they realized that I wasn't going to change. And there was something deeper than the stupid arguments we would have that never went anywhere at Thanksgiving, Christmas, or any other dinner table in our family.
Roberto, I haven't even been invited to Thanksgiving. Y'all came for the drama. Let me tell you, we fight in my house. That's why I'm not allowed back into the Thanksgiving.
Wow.
Whatever, I make my own turkey. But listen, we have more questions.
Turkey, not turkey.
Chumba,
Turkey. That's what my mom said it.
Yes, but it also relates to the next question, which talks about the language that you use in the book. So this question, some of my favorite moments in the book were the camaraderie you felt and experienced with other characters in the book, and in sharing Salvadoran, I think, you know, the Salvadoran accents, right? Or the words we use, and then the Californian calor, which brings me back to think about spatial memory and culture. And these moments brought me home, being a kid from Los Angeles and Southern California. And these moments were also used to balance the emotional highs and lows in the book. So the question is, was it important for you to have an emotional high coincide with an emotional low? And then did you choose that balance? Was it something you did, you know, that was intentional?
In the book?
Sorry?
In the book?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like when I knew my story, what my story was going to be, because it's my story, literally. So I'm like, damn, dude, I got to traverse 2,500 miles of war, genocide, mass graves, gang violence, policing, militarism. Dude, nobody's going to read your fucking book after the first chapter. It's going to be a downer. But then I'm like, how the hell am I going to get out of this? And I'm like, the answer came, hey man, how did you get through life? And the way I got through life was through the beauty, the sublime things, the music, the love, the tenderness, things that were always there despite all the racist garbage that is written about us, whether we are just Salvadorans or whether we are revolutionaries, or even if we are gang members. There's always this other side that you mentioned, Esther. It's always there. And in our experience, mass murder and tenderness were never separate. They just weren't. And I think that's our lesson for the world right now. And so absolutely, I had to excavate all that beauty in my family, all that language that my father, honestly, my father's a really brilliant guy, like with language. He has a second grade education, and he would create his own words, or he had like 100 names for me, like I was Alaskan, ice for Alaskans, right? He'd call me like Chiriqua. I go, hey, Pop, where the hell that name come from? Bueno, hay unos indios que son de aquí que le llaman Chiricahua. Sí, me gusta el nombre, so you're Chiriqua. Or, Guarapo. Okay, Guarapo, where'd you get that name? Well, es un licor. No sé de dónde. And he would he'd call my brother Niwita, a word that he created. And he would actually later on, he would quote like Spanish poets that were really popular back when in the 30s in El Salvador, poetry was not, and in El Salvador generally and in Latin America, poetry is not this artsy-fartsy thing that you get a Yaddo grant to go talk often silly pro-capitalist shit. It's, it was just part of the culture where, people shared it. Like my cousin digging out from underneath an almond tree, the pamphlets that were revolutionary pamphlets and cassette tapes with Yolo Cambayita and poetry by this guy named Roque Dalton, right? So the poetry was always more part of the fabric in these cultures. Like, I mean, in El Salvador, one of the 5 political military organizations of the FMLN that became one was founded by poets. Poets were founding revolutionary organizations. In Nicaragua, you had like Ernesto Cardenal, a priest and a magnificent poet, joining the revolutionary movement. And, when they weren't, they had compañeros in the mountains in Nicaragua and El Salvador who, they were fighting by day, and then by night they'd go back to the campfire or get away from all the compas, and they'd start writing poetry and reading it. And so that whole, that's kind of the gorgeousness that I try to get into the book, the love of language and the culture that's so rich in us. And like the person mentioned Calo, like, I have friends who are linguists, like Otto Santana at UCLA, and Otto and some of his other scholarly friends taught me about the way that I talk, like orale, and like I have like, I'm born on Folsom Street. I'm not from El Salvador. I'm born on around Folsom Street. I grew up here in the city. I'm a city dude, and I talk a certain way that I learned that I have an accent when I lived in New York. I never knew I had an accent until I lived in New York. And so I'm like, these linguists are telling me like, yeah, the way you talk, like that kind of cholo, low rider language that I have, orale, I adopted Chicanismos because there weren't a whole lot of Central Americans, so I had to go to Chicano to get something that was non-white. And so I had all this language that was, coming from the prisons here in California, right? The Cholo language. And then I find out from the linguist that language actually comes from Mexico and the Calo language. And where does Calo come from? Calo came from the Gitanos who were in medieval Spain and other parts of Europe, who jumped on the ships and they were in the underworld of Europe, using this language that was kind of like, it was equated with the language of the underworld because their existence as Gitanos, gypsies, Roma peoples, was marginal and therefore underworld. And so they brought their language across on the ships of the conquistadores, landed in Mexico, and then eventually that language migrated with Mexicans north to the point where it ended up here and ended up on my tongue. It's like, whoa, what a trip. And so there's that. There's my father, like my father will tell you about a president who told him, bueno, a president who was drunk gave a speech one time, and he says, sí, yo nací en Cerotepec. Entonces a mí me dicen Cerote Pequeño. Right? I mean, this is kind of something my father would come up with, and like really the way that like, there's just our way of being that way is bien chistoso, right? And so our tongues have all this richness on them that if we just go under the surface of them, there's a lot of beauty and humor and love and terror and other things there.
Well, you have to laugh. If you don't laugh, you'll just cry the whole time, right?
Sí, pareciera ser otro.
See, there you go again with these puns.
I'm sorry, we're not on radio, so I can say these things. And sorry, students, if I'm offending your sensibilities. I know my friend Martin, real Christian guy, he's getting offended. I can see his face right now.
We have time for, let's say, one question more, I think. Yeah, and then.
Yeah, so let me combine
energy.
Let me combine some of the items that we have left in the chat. Let me think creatively. What I see in the chat that Susana is asking, will the book appear in Spanish? While I think about the last question.
Yes, that's an easy one.
Okay, great. So I see questions about youth the youth experience, and also about the educational context. Now, Roberto, you're one of the core people who's participated in the Central American Studies program in the past at Cal State Northridge, and I know that you've taught at multiple universities. And so folks are asking, what would you tell a younger version of yourself? Folks are asking, how would you teach, a course about these experiences? And I'm also thinking how I would integrate your book. How do you see your book integrated into the courses that we teach? And someone's also asking, how do we ensure that Salvadoran or Central American students on college campuses feel heard and incorporated, even though Mexican students might still represent the majority among Latinx communities? So this is kind of just a combo of where the chat was headed.
Okay, wow, that's a lot of questions.
Just
in terms of like courses, it's already being adopted. I'm blown away by how many people are adopting my book already, and they're adopting it in different disciplines, from American studies, MFA programs, ethnic studies. Here in California, there's like 500 students are going to be reading my book for 3 weeks in an ethnic studies class.
That's amazing.
American studies, obviously, criminal justice, sociology. I mean, I'm really like, it's just really kind of pleasing to me, because I do want young people to read my book. I think I didn't write it with any audience in mind, but I guarantee you, young people will find echoes of your own experience, and you'll feel a heart that's beating like yours, beating with love, beating with rage, beating with a desire to change the world in a revolutionary way right now. You'll find that I put everything I had into this book so that you could find yourself somewhere in those lines. There's a love story in it, and my love story in it takes place in the middle of the war, right? Again, you see, like,
to that part, Roberto.
Huh?
They're gonna have to read the book to find out of the love story.
Yeah. They're gonna have to read the book. And so yeah, it's being I would integrate, I mean, it's already being integrated in different ways. I think people are really taken with the structure, the way that I jump back and forth across time and place, time and space, and the kind of like trauma studies, and or just really, I mean, honestly, like I wrote it and I wanted to get as close to my favorite movie, one of my favorite movies as possible. I wanted to do what one of my favorite movies does. You know what one of my favorite movies is The Matrix. So at one level, The Matrix is an action movie, right? And so my life like has some action in it, right? There's war, there's love, there's violence and policing and all this stuff that's a firsthand experience. Death squads chasing us down, mass killings, blah, 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 and the fight for social justice and revolution. And so that's at one level, but The Matrix, if you look at it like 500 times, like I've seen it, you'll find all these different threads of meaning and philosophy, the occasional poetic moment in there in between the lines, but you got to read it again. Like somebody yesterday said, damn, I just read your book again, and I found this and this and this. Like, yes, exactly. That's the point. That's why you write. And I try to do it in a beautiful way. So yeah, the book has a lot of different threads. As far as Central Americans in a Mexican universe, that's my story. I grew up mostly among Mexicans in the mission. And we had a lot of Central Americans, but the institutions were Mexican, right? The La Raza organizations, mission neighborhood centers, and all these, they were founded by mostly Mexicans, some Salvadorans and Central Americans. And so I kind of like, I was grateful to the Chicanos and Chicano thinking and ideology and ways of being, because it was either that or assimilate and become white like relatives of mine had done. And so I had to kind of like, some of my best friends, even to this moment, some of my lifetime friends, are Mexican, like my friend Armando, who lives right here in the Mission. He took me to his hometown in Durango, Mexico, and I can dance like norteño music better than most Chicanos. I'm sorry if that offends anybody, but I think it's been proven on the dance floor a few times. And so like, I grew up loving Mexican culture because it saved me from the assimilationist tendencies of a racist country like the United States. That said, I understand contemporary Central American youth who are growing up at a different time where we are now no longer having, you have Central American studies, because yeah, I helped co-found that discipline with actually the off the record story. Those of us that founded Central American Studies at Northridge, everybody's an ex-guerrillero. So we were teaching not just academic knowledge, but we were teaching kind of leadership of another order with the support of Chicano studies at Northridge with people like Rudy Acuna. And so that's an example of the solidarity that's always existed between Mexicans and Central Americans, in addition to the tensions that have also been there, often flamed and pushed by the state and kind of the divisionist interest that you see in Donald Trump or even Joe Biden. Like, do I agree with Joe Biden's approach to Latinos? Hell no. Like it was an embarrassment of a Democratic convention. You didn't even have Julian Castro, who I could give a flying rolling donut about, right? Because he didn't say shit about the caging of Central American children. But but as a Latinx person, I'm like, hey man, you didn't have any. You gave Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez 1 minute, and you gave this fascist Democrat. Anyway, I'm getting off course, but
I think what you're saying is key, that there's things that hold us.
There's things that hold us together and there's things that separate us. And a lot of young people right now are struggling, I see, with the fact that the Mexican government is treating Central Americans the way it is. And I share that concern, but I don't extend it to all the Mexican people, which I see some young people doing, and I think erroneously, quite frankly, because if you just kind of blanket all Mexicans as being like this, and us blanket being under their shadow, then you're going to miss out all the nuance, the detail, the intermarriage. All you Mexican and like Steve Osuna is a major Salvadoran scholar. Es mitad Mexicano. What, we're going to boot him out because he's half Mexican? I don't think so.
Wait, right? I am too.
You are too?
Yeah, but people don't know that because I go so hard for El Salvador.
Wow, but we're going to have to cancel this whole talk we just did. I'm a Salvadoran nationalist, and I don't want anybody, unless they're pure Salvadoran, to be interviewing me. This is
hey, you know what, Roberto? It's been wonderful to chat with you, and we're at time. Before we adjourn, I believe my department chair, Carolina Sternberg, has a final word for us.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm out of words after all this talk. I really want to thank you both, especially Roberto, for sharing all your knowledge, all these stories that make this book even more interesting. Now I feel like I have to go back and reread it. And for sharing also your good humor, because I feel like that's part of also the process of healing, right? That's part of going through the abyss, as you were saying. So thank you very much to both for bringing all these stories and good humor together. And I hope we can, talk again face to face next time and share a lot of stories that coming from Argentina also have some, of course, traumatic past. And yeah, I don't know if you, Roberto or Esther, want to add any words. Oh, I forgot to mention, to remind people to buy the book. They won't regret it, and they won't forget a lot of stories there. And also, people, you have to go and vote. I urge you to go and vote. Yes, those are my final words.
Esther?
No, thank you everybody for joining us. And I see Roberto has dropped his email in the chat.
Yeah, my author email's there. People tend to want to talk with me after. It'll take me a while sometimes to get back to people, but that's the email I use to interact with folks. I'll eventually get back to you if you want to talk about something important, or I don't know, I don't have a lot of time for small talk, quite frankly. So even though I like to joke a lot and everything, but, and with that, I would just like to echo what Carolina said. We are in as challenging a moment as I, with everything that I've experienced, have witnessed in the United States. It's not as bad as the thing that I've witnessed, quite frankly, because there's nothing as bad as war. But we are on the precipice of very extreme things. And I just want to encourage you young people to take on to your heart the things that you most value and do everything you can to fight fascism that's rising right now. That's no joke. These people are serious, they're murderous, they're sinister. And but we are more than them. We are more numerically, we are more morally, and we are very capable. There's, if you feel fear, it's natural, but fearlessness is not getting rid of fear. It is knowing the fear and doing what you need to do anyway. And so I encourage you to be fearless right now and intrepid and zealous as you can be to fight like it's the fight of your life, because it is. And if you want to feel what that spirit's like, for me, it's in my book. It's the best that I have up to date to give. And I thank you, Carolina, and everyone and Esther and everyone for joining us. And I'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you.
Thank you, Alex, too, that you've been like a soldier there. Thank you. Take care, you all.